what I'm going to do in this talk is to show you different technologies and strategies that they have developed, but also I'll sort of talk about how, as Donna Haraway explains, how to stay with the trouble. So just keep in mind that this talk is an invitation to stay with the trouble and to understand how disappearances and kidnappings are sort of very well related, as we have been discussing throughout all the day, and how we sort of understand these different types of absences in Mexico. So that's roughly what I'm going to do. So last week, I was in the middle of a conversation with the director of, can I have the sort of, sure. Oh, thank you. Thanks. So last week, I was in the middle of the conversation with the director of a Mexican NGO loving to tackle kidnapping in Mexico, and Amelia, a human rights defender that helps families to search and locate disappeared women in the state of Mexico, a very sort of dangerous place in Mexico. They were discussing the successes and shortcomings that the Mexican security strategy has had in combating kidnapping in the country. The NGO director was convinced that the country has achieved high success rates in combating this crime. And a great part of this success was related to the fact that for an event to be labeled as a kidnapping, there is the need to have a ransom call or a ransom negotiation. Amelia, on the other hand, while recognizing that there has been a progress in combating security in the country, so the condition of needing this ransom call or some sort of negotiation to prompt police action are too narrow and disenfranchised from her everyday practice of searching and advocating for victims of disappearance / kidnappings / femicides. So I choose this NGO leader, NGO director was calling, when he was discussing this, he said at one point, I was invited here to talk about kidnappings, not about disappearances. So making this very clear distinction between these two types of absences. So the importance of this little vignette that I'm sharing with you today couldn't be more relevant to what we are discussing. This discussion speaks to what I found while working with families in Mexico. So families in Mexico and those who experience insecurity in their everyday lives understand these type of crimes as fluid states of absence. Their sons and daughters could be absent as a part of a kidnapping, an enforced disappearance, or a disappearance. And it's precisely the complexity and fluidity within criminal behaviors what has challenged state-led responses to tackle them. At the same time, this fluidity has opened up the spaces for citizen-led responses to emerge. So this is what I'm sort of further discuss now. I see this fluidity particularly in action when analyzing the different ways in which families in Mexico have been developing these strategies to collect and analyze data on the disappearance of their sons and daughters. This practice is what we have called citizen-led forensics, a set of strategies and technologies developed by families, again, to locate and identify their loved ones. And this includes their own collective efforts to gather evidence and data, such as the citizen-led forensic DNA database that I'm going to talk about. So just to talk about the different technologies that I have been using, I would like to start with the list. Like, we usually don't think about a list of names and data on disappearances as a powerful technology. But it was precisely here, near in Ciudad Juárez, where Esther Chavez Cano started gathering information on the reports of family members who were searching for their missing daughters. In a small notebook, she began to write down details of the women whose dead bodies were appearing in desert areas along the city's outer edges. Yet as part of the preparations that they were having to meet with the local mayor, one of Esther's friends, Maria Elena Vargas, decided to turn these little notes into data. So she was using this program, Excel. She decided to convert these handwritten accounts and abductions dates into data. So, as we know, local authorities have consistently showed no interest in collecting information on death and disappearances of missing women. But precisely this list became the official record of the disappearing in Ciudad Juárez. It was one of the first products of a form of citizen-led technology. It became the leading source of independent data on deaths and disappearances. This list challenged local authorities' expertise and brought to an end the state's monopoly on criminal data. As I'll argue, this list, it also opened up new possibilities for alternative modes of forensic knowledge to be produced. So one of the technologies that this list started would be the idea of playing with legal definitions. So even though establishing whether the missing person has been the victim of a crime is a state prerogative, authorities, in the religion of their duties, place on families the burden of determining whether the person that is missing had left voluntarily or not. So in several cases I've documented in my work, families reported that the local authorities had discouraged them to file a report by warning them of the potentially dangerous consequences, such as death threats or harassments that could follow. And even when they decided to file a report, they were faced until recently with the problem that to disappear is not a crime. And then the only way to prompt police action was to comply with legal definitions, for instance, that of the kidnapping. In order to do this, families learn to buy a mobile phone, disposable mobile phone, to make the ransom call themselves, so that they can show this to the authorities. We learned from what happened to us the first time. So this time, we didn't wait for a ransom call. I bought a disposable phone and called my own number, so that I can have something to show the authorities to say that this was a kidnapping and they had to search for my cousins. Another form in which families are engaging with these forensic technologies is through data analysis, but also locating security houses. And I'm going to talk about, according to sort of records, official records, or the records that families have been collecting, more than 70% of disappearances start with a kidnapping. So now I'm going to talk about a case of kidnapping and how families started to engage with different technologies in order to locate their loved ones. So once, the day after her son's abduction, Letty received a ransom call. The kidnappers promised to return Roy to his family as soon as they received the demanded sum. While it was a struggle, the family gathered the money and paid the ransom, but Roy has yet to come back home. A couple of months later, after Roy's abduction, Letty realized that despite having filed a report with the army, they were neither searching for Roy nor gathering information on any abduction. The family decided to start her own search. They paid for a global position system to be installed in one of the mobile phones that the kidnappers had stolen in order to gather information on the calls made from the device. Using the GPS software, analyzing attendant positions, and cell phone tower locations, the family successfully tracked activity of the phone numbers from which he had been receiving the calls. I didn't know how to use this is Letty. And she was telling me, I didn't know how to use a computer. I mean, just emails and that kind of stuff. But then, along with my husband and family, we started following the signal coming from the mobile phones that were in use. We tracked the red dots on the computer, and then, with the help of a local map, we spent our time deciphering the exact roads and houses where the red dots were coming from. In the end, we collected 16 well-identified addresses and we took nearly 80 photographs. We marked them very clearly with big arrows to avoid confusion, to clearly show the houses where the mobile signals were coming from. The family collected all this information and analyzed where the mobile phone signal was active at night or during long periods of time as a way to establish behavior patterns of those who have taken their son away. In order to locate the specific addresses, they used Google Maps, but also Guía Roji, which is a detailed map of the state of Nuevo León, produced by a private Mexican cartography company. The family took all this information, the maps, the photographs, the call log analysis, to the military forces and asked them to use the information provided to visit some of the places that they have identified as security houses. After insisting several times, the officers finally agreed to visit some of these locations. 3 kidnapped victims and 2 captors, along with drugs, guns, and vehicles that had been reported as stolen, were found at the first location alone. The family continued paying for the mobile phone bills and GPS software for over 2 years to keep gathering information on whether these individuals were calling from and whom they were calling. So families' engagement with this type of data, which I call forensic data, is extensive and diverse. They have been using all this data in order to follow or retrace their loved ones' journeys, to triangulate cell phone company information from different mobile antennas and establish a specific parameter from where to start the search. In particular, in this particular case, it was used to understand the mobility patterns of those who had taken Roy. However, with all the data she had gathered, it has not been enough to determine where Roy was. Tracing the calls allow us to establish the location of the mobile phone, but not necessarily that of Roy's. So visibility and what all these different practices of data collection have brought forward is a form of visibility, and sort of understanding visibility as a condition for action. It was all these data that Letty collected which prompt police action. One of the other ways in which families have been engaging is creating this type of archives where they have evidence of all the data they have collected, and maps, a lot of maps. The other way in which families have been engaging with forensic data and forensic knowledge is through our forensic DNA database. So in 2014-2015, I was part of the citizen-led forensic project, taking it as a starting point the expertise as families have acquired over the years they have been conducting searches and analyzing this data individually. We decided to bring together a group of families in Mexico, or mothers, in order to create the first citizen-led forensic governance mechanism where relatives of disappeared persons manage, govern, and own their own forensic technologies, a national registry of disappeared persons, and a forensic DNA database. According to the data collected in this National Registry of Disappeared Persons, more than 70% of the disappearances that have been registered started as a kidnapping. Sort of just a little video of how the whole project was carried out in Mexico. So the collection and analysis of these different type of data could be understood as transaction data. So Luisa Moore and Marika Dahuda discuss how transaction data has become central to security practices. Mobile people and things leave traces from everyday life, such as grocery shopping records, patterns of past travel, credit card purchases, and retail preferences, just to name a few. These traces can be conceived as a transaction data, a way of mapping, visualizing, and recognizing bodies in movement. The analysis of transaction data has helped families to decide where to start a search and how to see and explore the city. This citizen practice makes visible those places that the materiality of a corrupt state would otherwise conceal. So, by analyzing this data, families have been able to rescue victims of kidnapping, or in the case of the citizen-led DNA database, they were able to highlight the high levels of violence that were occurring in the country, among other things. So this is one of the examples of how citizens were collecting their own DNA data. The relevance of analyzing transaction data lies in its ability to delineate spaces and possibilities that open up when practices of data collection and analysis cease to be an exclusive prerogative of the state and become part of the everyday knowledge of families. Citizen collection of transaction data enables a different kind of politics and security decisions to be made. The whole idea of citizen-led forensics is precisely an attempt to understand, play, and experiment with absences and disappearances in Mexico. It constitutes a forensic effort that works with and through the completeness of human experience in order to open up different futures. These citizen-led forensic efforts continuously avoid the closure that the government often try to achieve. So unlike most databases and the way in which we think about forensic technologies that are objective and rigid, and this sort of touch upon something we were discussing before, how do we understand technologies and affect and loss and intimacy? These databases and the practices that I have explained or described are flexible and work through the incompleteness of situated objectivity. It is precisely this flexibility what allow it to continue to exist and respond to the logics that are not dictated by bureaucratic efficiency or the needs and times of experts. As I said at the beginning, these citizen-led practices of forensics are an invitation to stay with the trouble, in Donna Haraway's terms. They transform digitally mediated modes of digitally mediated modes of knowledge production and make visible the violence and insecurity that the Mexican state has long denied. So as a way to sort of final points for discussion. So I would like to sort of talk a little about just think about transaction data, what does that mean, and how a ransom call can trigger or not police action, whether other types of citizen-led initiatives sometimes get dismissed. And think more also through mobility and the traces that are left behind. So how do we work with these traces and who gets to work with them? And I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I also clap? Final points for discussion. So I would like to sort of talk a little about just think about transaction data, what does that mean, and how a ransom call can trigger or not police action, whether other types of citizen-led initiatives sometimes get dismissed. And think more also through mobility and the traces that are left behind. So how do we work with these traces and who gets to work with them? And I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I also clap?